This is lecture 1 in Introduction to Politics, and in this short lecture I'll give you a brief overview of the terrain we hope to cover in the course itself. First thing to note is there is a tendency when people think politics, either in theory or practice, to become cynical, skeptical, retreat from the fray, and they can usually hand out a laundry list of reasons why not to get involved in politics in terms of promises betrayed, parties they're not consistent in terms of what they have offered in elections, politicians who are not at times the most consistent of character, but people can go on in terms of being skeptical and cynical of the political process itself. And if a person starts from a position of skepticism and cynicism, then we might as well fold our hands, give up, and go do something else in life. The difficulty, of course, in doing so is that much of what we do and much of how people live, move, and have their being is the product of politics. And so we can't avoid politics. And between, on the one hand, a naive optimism, and the other hand, a paralyzed skepticism, which leaves people impotent, is a middle way between trying to understand the legitimate role of politics, the good that it contributes, and obviously the place for meaningful questioning and criticism of it. But let's just briefly, before I move a little further on, look at how we are the recipients of political choices. We're living presently through the COVID pandemic or crisis, as most people are more than aware. So what has been the role of politics in this? I mean, on the one hand, one could argue, well, people in the political realm at a provincial or federal level, they should just hands off and let things happen as they will. Well, we know that would just lead to chaos. And so in the midst of this COVID crisis, we've had the role of doctors, scientists, politicians working together as much and as far as possible to deal with this so it doesn't get worse. And where there is no coordination, we got the experience of, say, United States across the border, or Mexico or Brazil across the water, Italy, France, immense acceleration of deaths, and obviously those who've been diagnosed with it. Businesses which have been affected by COVID. What would happen if at a federal or provincial government it was just laissez-faire, hands off? That's too bad. COVID crisis has come through. We close your business down, but we're not going to do anything to support the people who run various either small level or medium-sized businesses. Again, it is the role of, in this case, the federal and provincial governments to assist businesses. That's politics. The roads we drive on, that's a result of politics. The roads at their best are kept drivable. Our healthcare system, universal healthcare, that's politics. If we have illness in family because of decisions made politically, we have a universal healthcare system. Without that, you get privatization of healthcare with the costs that go into that, and those who can't afford it, the dilemma that they're put in. Education, because we believe in public education, taxation, higher taxation, a result of that. The price of tuition is a little cheaper than in private education. That's politics. Parks that we have when people want to get away into the outdoors, or broadly speaking, lakes, mountains, rivers. It is the role, again, of politics as much as possible to create public space for people so they're not mired only in city urban life, but rural and broader ecological concerns as well as that come from that. A minimum pay that people should receive. If there was no involvement of political thinking, what would probably happen, not probably, but would happen, is that wages would be much lower, obviously, and benefits and many other elements that would drive people into a position in which they would be obviously going into debt and other situations, I guess. So it's politics that makes decisions, sets standards for people. in terms of their lifestyle. And so those who are merely cynical or skeptical of politics don't realize all the benefits they receive as a result of both politics as theory and then politics as practice, both from, in Canada, federal, provincial, and also a municipal level. This does not mean, if a person is interested in politics, that just by sheer engagement that things are going to work out well. Inevitably, there's conflicts. This is where ideology comes in. There's people have different understandings of what the good is and how that good is brought about. This is where we get the clashes in economics. To what degree should a state be involved? To what degree should the state step out and allow the market to determine? The whole hot button issues of the culture wars that we're living right now at the present time. Social justice warriors on one hand, you get conservative reactionaries on the other. This is people trying to make sense of how they interpret the common good in the public square. That's politics. Politics just coming from polis, or the city-state in that sense. So there's no way, in short, of escaping politics. To the degree we live with people in cities, in communities, we are either the beneficiaries of that. We can raise questions about how things take place, but there can be no doubt that the world that we live in is constantly one in which decisions made at a whole variety of public levels have an impact on us. So cynicism, in that sense, most cynics are not cynical of cynicism, or most skeptics are not skeptical of cynicism, and so it becomes, in one sense, on the one hand, intellectually an indulgent position, bordering on narcissism. On the other hand, it simply ignores the fact that those who are the cynics benefit greatly from political decisions. And if one was to wipe the slate of all the benefits they get from it, then there certainly would be many protests at work. So there is this double bind of many cynics. On the one hand, they often retreat from the fray. On the other hand, they enjoy the bounty of political decisions being made at many, many levels in their life. So that's just a brief introduction of the four things we'll be looking at in an introduction to politics, for this is just an introduction to politics, and in that sense will be like the Aesop's fable of the fox that rambles across broad terrain, checking out this, checking out that, looking at different ways of understanding what is on the terrain of the political world. And unlike the hedgehog, we won't be doing many deeper dives. This will be a course introduction, usually is more, as I mentioned, like the fox. Worse yet, it can be more like a jackrabbit running in a variety of directions. But the four broad acreages we want to look at in this course, in terms of an introduction to politics at least, which then in time, if those of you who get keen on that, you can move off, take trails to these different acreages or homesteads or areas of politics to focus on a little more. So the first area one could look at, of course, being in Canada, is Canadian politics. And Canadian political tradition can be broken down into the history of Canadian political thought, the theory, and then, of course, the history of Canadian institutions, political parties, men and women who have played significant role in politics, how government works, what's the nature of federalism, provincialism, what's the relationship of municipality to province to a federal government. All of these elements, charters, BNA Act, it gives students a sense of what it means to be a citizen at the level of theory and of practice. And anyone who obviously is grown up in Canada or has immigrated to Canada, of course, in Canadian political thought, culture, history, institutions, charters, political parties, history, is very, very important to understand how things work in this country. And that would then give people a greater sense of why things are the way they are. So that's one area to look at, is Canadian Canadian culture, Canadian political thought, Canadian institutions, which are very important, how that works itself out in terms of domestic policy in Canada, foreign policy, why does Canada take certain positions it does, our relationship with the United States, why we have historically broken off or weaned ourselves from England and France, the relationship of First Nations, how they have been treated in the Canadian context, the work that is going on in that area. So that's one area to look at. Then the complex and layered, multi-layered nature of Canadian politics. The second area would be comparative politics. So in one sense, this doesn't necessarily exclude Canada, but comparing how governments work both at political levels and parapolitical levels. So how is Canada different, for example, than the United States in terms of how we do things politically, how elections take place, how power is distributed. So comparative politics gives us a sense of where does Canada fit into other countries in terms of our understanding of the common good and how we think through that institutionally. What's the nature of political parties, the nature of voting, and of course the challenge of different voting patterns these days between first past the post and proportional representation. Or other forms of comparative politics, for example, within Europe itself, comparing different political systems in terms of North America. So that's an approach to comparative politics. Or Middle Eastern politics in Africa, or Japan, or China. Comparative politics can be approached in a variety of ways, from first world to second world to third world. And how do these different political systems operate? How did they come into being, and what are the consequences of that? And so that's another very important area to reflect on. The third area is one of political philosophy or political theory. So it's one thing to be thinking of parties, institutions, histories, leading women and men in different countries or states and nations. But how have, within the West and with other traditions for that matter, women and men thought about the common good, or what is justice, and what is peacemaking, and what are ecological issues, and how does the right and the left divide on these issues? What is human identity? What's the nature of human desire? How does one order desires towards the common good? And if there is no sense of ordering, is there such a thing as human identity? Is there a human nature, or are we just open books that we are written on when young and then we write back as we move along in the human journey? So political philosophy, political theory it's a sort of a bridge between philosophy and some of the hard facts or institutions and charters and laws that you get in what's called political science. And so some people are very interested, if they come from a background interested in philosophy. Political philosophy is a nice bridge between philosophy and the more political science element of it. And so this is important. And so the fourth area then would be international relations, in which is the study of the larger international institutions such as United Nations, intergovernment organizations, non-government organizations, theories of how one interprets what's happening in the world, realism, idealism, nature of military, multinational corporations, the big actors and actresses on the stage of politics. And so international relations, international organizations looks at the big picture, the epic picture in terms of how is this drama, how has it been played out, nature of war and peace, obviously. How has this drama evolved? How has it unfolded throughout history? And then what is the role of larger states, empires, middle powers, smaller powers? Who are the actors that make alliances? What role do human rights play in this? So the international relations opens up for people these larger issues in terms of the dynamics of power, of human rights, of ideals, of realism, and then how different states work that out, different regional organizations, whether in the Middle East or Africa, obviously in the Americas, North America, Latin America, Europe. International relations is really concerned with this larger puzzle and how the pieces dynamically are always in motion and fitting together in this. So these four areas then we'll be looking at in this course, Introduction to Politics, is important to get a sense and feel for, like, as I mentioned, the fox who rambles across the train. One more comment. Political science is often given that name, political science, and in that sense, there's the sense that political science is a science. It's about hard facts. It's about objectivity. It's something that can be verified and falsified through experimentation. But most of the direction in terms today, and the book we'll be using, does not use the word political science. It's more political studies. It's important to understand political studies is probably a truer reflection and description of what politics is about, because on the one hand there can be the scientific, the hard facts, the dates, the institutions, the laws, the courts, all of these things in which one can nail down and say these are hard facts, these are the results of election, these are the women and men who are MPs, MLAs, this is how a charter works, this is how the courts work. These are hard facts in which, in a sense, a certain form of science dominates. But there's many other areas, obviously, in the realm of politics, which are not hard facts. We cannot always predict a COVID that's coming along. We can't predict what a weather is going to do and how states are going to respond to that. We can't predict where at times there's going to be revolutions within states and how people are going to respond violently and non-violently. And this is why political philosophy is so important, because there's an ambiguity and mystery about the human condition itself. And this is why the humanities is very, very important within the framework of political studies itself. Because of this unpredictability, both of the broader natural world we live in, and then humans themselves as they interact with one another and with nature, politics cannot be reduced to a hard science. And so it's much better to just call it political studies. And so in this course, in the Introduction to Politics, we'll refer to political studies, of which there's a scientific wing on the one hand, and there's a much more philosophical tradition within the humanities itself. And so to some, Introduction to Politics is an attempt to find a middle way between the skepticism and cynicism of some who retreat and hence become paralyzed and impotent, often not cynical of cynicism itself, and the Pollyanna types on the right who think if I just get involved, the world will become better. And then the four elements we're going to look at: Canadian politics, political theory, comparative politics, and international relations. And then lastly, understanding that we'll call this political studies as an attempt to be faithful and reflect the two branches of politics, both its scientific side as well as its grounding in the humanities itself.